My husband stood smiling on a Hawaiian beach, his arm wrapped around her waist like it belonged there, the sun melting into the ocean behind them. That photograph wasn't meant for me to see, but I did. And in that moment, something in me shattered so quietly, I didn't even hear it until much later. I stared at the image for a long time, not because I was shocked he was with her. I had suspected the affair for months. No, what paralyzed me was the timing. He took her there just 2 weeks after we buried our only son. I had been drowning in grief, hollowed out by the silence that filled our home since Noah's laughter disappeared. Every corner echoed with memories, his toy cars still scattered under the couch, his sneakers by the door, his drawings taped proudly on the fridge. I couldn't bring myself to move anything. I couldn't even breathe properly. But James? He coped differently. He booked a trip to paradise with the woman he used to call his coworker. He packed his bags while I was still sleeping beside the stuffed bear Noah used to cling to at night. And he left me a note. Just a note. I need space. I'll be back in a few days. That's all. No mention of where he was going. No mention of her. No explanation. No goodbye. I didn't fall apart right away. Grief numbs you, makes you move in slow, strange patterns. I made tea I didn't drink. I watered plants that didn't need it. I stared out the window like the street might give me answers. But the image of them together, her laughing like she belonged in his arms, kept stabbing its way into my chest. The picture was sent to me anonymously. No message. No number. Just the image. Maybe someone pitied me. Maybe it was a mistake. Or maybe it was her, flaunting what she thought she'd won. I couldn't stop looking at it. The wind in her hair, the way he looked at her like she was the sun. I knew that look. Once it had been mine. When James came back 3 days later, he looked tan, relaxed, as if our world hadn't ended. He kissed my cheek like everything was normal, asked if I'd eaten. I said nothing. My silence made him uncomfortable, but not guilty. That was what told me everything. Guilt leaves traces, restless fingers, darting eyes, defensive tones. But James was smooth. He was too at ease. He thought I'd never find out. I waited 2 more weeks. Long enough to let the image of Noah's final moments dull into something I could carry without collapsing. Then I started gathering strength in quiet ways. I visited my old journals. I wrote down memories. I listened to Noah's voice recordings when I was alone. I reminded myself of who I was before pain changed me, before James failed me. I didn't yell. I didn't confront. Not yet. Instead, I became the woman James no longer noticed. I moved like a ghost through our house, watching, listening. I learned everything. Her name was Alyssa. He met her at a conference 8 months ago. She was younger, single, and bold. She liked art museums and wine tastings. She had no idea he had a wife grieving a dead child. Or maybe she did. I didn't know yet. I needed more. So I found her. Not in a confrontational way. I followed her Instagram. I learned her habits. I even saw her once at a bookstore, running her fingers across the spines like she was choosing a secret. She smiled when she read the back of a novel. She didn't look evil. That was the worst part. She looked ordinary, like someone who believed in happy endings. But I wasn't interested in her. My husband had made vows to me. She owed me nothing. He owed me everything. I planned carefully. No drama. No screaming. Revenge doesn't need volume. It needs precision. So I gathered documents, emails, transactions, proof of his affair, bank transfers, hotel bookings. I got everything I needed without ever touching his phone. James had grown careless. His arrogance had blinded him. That would be his downfall. I visited a lawyer quietly, told her everything. She was kind, calm, efficient. She asked if I wanted to file immediately. I said not yet. I had one more thing to do. James had forgotten Noah's memorial. The day came and went without him mentioning it. I sat at the cemetery alone, clutching my son's favorite dinosaur plush. That's when I decided I wasn't going to let James escape the way he always did, with charm and excuses. He had taken everything from me. My peace. My son's last days. My dignity. He deserved to feel what he made me feel, helpless, blindsided, alone. So, I invited him to dinner. He smiled when he saw the table. Candlelight. His favorite pasta. Soft music playing in the background. "This feels nice," he said, touching my hand like a husband again. I smiled back. "Before we eat," I said gently, "there's something I want to show you." I handed him a photo album. Inside were pictures of Noah, smiling, running, painting my face with his little hands. Each page held a memory. And tucked between those pages were printouts, emails between James and Alyssa, plane tickets to Hawaii, photos of them laughing while I wept. He looked up pale. His lips moved, but no sound came out. "I know everything," I whispered. "Every single thing." James tried to explain, of course. He said he was grieving too, that the affair didn't mean anything, that he was lost, that it was a mistake. I listened to him squirm. I let him cry. But my heart didn't move. "I'm not here for an apology," I said. "I'm here to return what you gave me." He looked confused. "Pain," I said. He tried to stand. I handed him a final envelope, divorce papers, financial penalties, custody arrangements for a house, which my lawyer ensured would be solely mine. I'd emptied our joint account a week earlier. Every dollar I could claim was transferred. Legally, strategically, mercilessly. "You can go now," I said, my voice even. "The keys stay with me." James didn't argue. He knew he'd lost. As the door closed behind him, the silence didn't feel hollow anymore. It felt earned. And for the first time in months, I breathed fully, deeply. Revenge didn't bring my son back, but it brought me back. And that was enough. Before everything unraveled, Elise Carter was the kind of woman people envied without meaning to. Not because she had an extraordinary life, but because she made the ordinary beautiful. She had a quiet strength, the kind that came from years of keeping her promises and choosing love even when it hurt. At 36, she had spent over a decade being a devoted wife and an even more devoted mother to Noah, the center of her universe. Elise worked part-time at the local library, a space she adored for its scent of old pages and childhood nostalgia, and she volunteered at Noah's school every other Friday. Her world was simple, fragile, and full. And then it shattered. Noah had just turned 7 when they lost him. It was a car accident. An ordinary day turned into the worst chapter of her life. One moment she was tying his shoelaces, telling him not to forget his lunchbox, and the next, she was answering the door to 2 officers with downcast eyes. It wasn't even James who got the call. Elise did. She was the one who had to identify him, trembling as she walked into a sterile, too cold hospital room to see her baby lifeless and still, his favorite superhero socks still on. She didn't scream. She didn't faint. She just folded, like a tree giving in to a storm it never saw coming. After the funeral, Elise became a shell of herself. The house, once filled with laughter and cartoons, became a mausoleum of memories. She couldn't bring herself to touch Noah's room. She left the night light on, as if he might still need it. She sat at his tiny desk and wrote him letters he'd never read. James, on the other hand, returned to work a week later. James Carter was many things: a charismatic businessman, a well-dressed problem solver, a man who could charm his way into or out of anything. He was never cruel, just absent. He didn't know how to hold pain. Not his own. Not Elise's. Especially not when it stared at him through eyes swollen from crying all night. He offered her coffee in the mornings, but didn't sit long enough to see if she drank it. He said he needed to focus on work, to keep things moving. Elise wanted to scream at him, to stop moving, to sit in the grief. But she didn't. She had no strength left for battles. She had once loved him deeply. James was her college sweetheart, the guy who stood outside her dorm every Sunday morning with coffee and crossword puzzles. He had proposed with a vintage ring passed down from his grandmother, claiming Elise was the only woman who ever made him want a quiet life. And for a while, it was true. He was tender, attentive, even poetic. But over the years, his ambitions grew, and the long hours began. Then came the business trips, the late-night texts, the perfume she didn't wear lingering on his suit. Elise had suspicions before Noah's death. A text she wasn't meant to see, a lipstick stain that didn't match hers. But she never confronted him. Part of her wanted to believe it was just her imagination, because confronting it meant acknowledging the cracks in their marriage were real. And she couldn't afford to fall apart. Not while she still had Noah. But once Noah was gone, there was no glue left to hold anything together. James didn't want to talk about their son. He flinched when Elise brought up memories, changed the subject, or left the room. He said things like, "We have to move forward, and you can't live in the past." Elise wanted to scream. Noah was the future. But James had already emotionally packed up and left. He was already seeing Alyssa. Alyssa Monroe was 29. Ambitious. Radiant in a polished, effortless way. She had started working in James's company just under a year ago, a marketing consultant with a knack for presentation and presence. She laughed easily, took risks, and wore confidence like a second skin. James was drawn to her, not just for her youth or her beauty, but for her lightness. She wasn't burdened by the weight of loss. She didn't cry in her sleep. She didn't sit in silence for hours. She made him feel untouched by grief. Their affair began at a conference in Miami. It was supposed to be one night. James convinced himself of that. But Alyssa made him feel seen in a way he hadn't in years. She didn't know about Noah. At first, James talked about a hard marriage, a wife who stopped loving him, and needing something more. It wasn't until after Hawaii that Alyssa finally asked, "Do you have kids?" And by then, it was too late to turn back. He told her the truth, softened of course, said they had a son, past tense, that it was too painful to discuss. She cried, said she didn't know, that she would have never. But she stayed. James thought he could keep both lives separate, grieve in silence and smile in public. But he underestimated Elise. She had always been the quiet one, but not the blind one. Back at home, Elise spent most days writing to Noah. Short letters. "I saw your favorite cereal at the store. The neighbor's cat still waits outside your window. Daddy went away. I think he's gone somewhere happy." She didn't talk much to others. Her friends tried to reach her. Some came by with casseroles and heavy sympathy, but grief makes people uncomfortable. Eventually, they stopped showing up. Elise didn't mind. She had started to observe everything with sharper clarity. She noticed James's lies before he told them. She memorized the rhythms of his absences. She even learned the pattern of his excuses. Still, she waited. She knew she had to let him dig his own grave first. And she knew, deep down, she wasn't the same woman anymore. The Elise who forgave and waited and hoped had been buried with her son. What was left now was quieter but colder. Focused. Ready. The conflict between them wasn't loud. It was made of silences. The kind where eyes don't meet anymore. Where grief lives in separate rooms. Where one spouse is mourning a child and the other is mourning a version of life he never wanted. James didn't hate Elise. But he resented her pain. It was inconvenient. Heavy. And worse, it reminded him of what he couldn't fix. So instead of sitting with her pain, he found someone who made him forget it. Elise, on the other hand, didn't resent James at first. She just mourned differently. In solitude. In small rituals. Folding Noah's favorite shirt, lighting a candle beside his photo, keeping his toothbrush in the holder. But the moment she saw that photo, the one with James and Alyssa smiling under a Hawaiian sunset, something snapped. That was the moment Elise realized she was done being the grieving wife left behind. She had lost a child. She refused to lose her self-respect too. The setting of this story was their home in Richmond, a quiet suburban neighborhood where everyone kept secrets behind trimmed hedges and holiday wreaths. Their house was 2 stories, white shutters, garden out front. The kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. But inside, it was a museum of tension. Long silences. Careful words. The smell of grief clinging to the walls like dust no one dared clean. At night, Elise often lay awake, hearing James's shallow breathing beside her, wondering if he was dreaming about her or her. She wondered how long she had been invisible to him, how long he had been playing pretend. But revenge wasn't born out of jealousy. It was born out of betrayal, of being discarded during the worst chapter of her life, of being replaced while she mourned the one person who had loved her unconditionally. James thought he had gotten away with it, that his wife was too broken to fight back, that she would either stay quiet or fade away. But James had forgotten something vital. Grief doesn't weaken everyone. Sometimes, it sharpens them into something terrifyingly focused. Elise was no longer a woman grieving. She was a woman plotting. And the clock had already started ticking. Elise's quiet war began with precision. No screaming. No dramatic confrontation. Just calm, calculated steps. After James returned from Hawaii, she didn't let on that she knew. She greeted him with a tired smile, handed him his favorite tea, and nodded absently when he mentioned how stressful his meetings had been. But behind her stillness was a storm gathering momentum. Every morning, while he shaved and scrolled through his emails, Elise copied data from his laptop. Every night, when he dozed off on the couch watching TV, she traced his calls and printed receipts. She collected evidence, not out of spite, but out of clarity. She wanted the truth, documented, undeniable. The photo had cracked the glass, but it was the web of lies beneath it that turned Elise cold. James began to sense something was off about a week after his return. Elise wasn't confrontational, but she wasn't present either. Her silences grew longer, her eyes more distant. Meals were quiet, conversations minimal. At first he assumed it was grief. The same grief he had tried to outrun. But it wasn't. It was awareness. Elise was awake in a way she hadn't been in months, and James had no idea how dangerous that could be. Then came the press. It started with a local parenting blog Elise had followed for years. A post appeared, anonymous but hauntingly familiar. Asterisk, he took her to paradise while I was still washing our son's blood out of his toy car. Asterisk, the piece didn't mention names, but it didn't have to. Elise's friends knew. Her neighbors knew. The community knew who had lost a child just weeks earlier. Sympathy poured in quietly. Mothers dropped flowers at her door. Someone left a note on her windshield that read, Asterisk, you deserved so much more. Asterisk, James's image in the community began to crack. Whispers at the golf club. Cold stares at the grocery store. Even his colleagues began to distance themselves. No one confronted him directly, but the air changed. Meetings grew terse. Calls went unanswered. His charm, once his greatest weapon, no longer carried weight in rooms filled with quiet judgment. Alyssa, too, began to unravel. She hadn't expected the backlash. She hadn't known the full story, and when she did, she was horrified. You told me she was cold, she cried during one of their hushed phone calls. You didn't tell me she was grieving a child. James tried to explain, said he hadn't meant to hurt anyone, that it was complicated, that he was trying to survive. But Alyssa, for all her boldness, wasn't built for scandal. She quit the company a month later and moved out of state. The weight of public disdain was more than she could carry. But Elise grew stronger. She began to find pieces of herself again, not in large, triumphant moments, but in small, sacred acts. She went back to the library twice a week, sorted Noah's things, finally, with care and ceremony, donated his books to children's shelters, planted a tree in the yard in his name, and every night, she lit a candle in the kitchen window, letting it burn until morning, like a lighthouse guiding her through each stormy night. But it wasn't easy. Grief never leaves fully. It hides in pockets, in music, in empty chairs. There were nights she collapsed in the hallway, clutching his last drawing. Days she would wake up expecting his footsteps and realize they were gone forever. There were dreams where he was alive, calling her name, only to disappear the moment she opened her eyes. James, too, began to fracture. The man who once navigated life like a boardroom, strategic, composed, powerful, began to falter. His work suffered. He drank more, argued with colleagues, lost clients. He tried, once, to fix things with Elise. He brought home flowers, suggested counseling, even cried at the kitchen table one night, saying he'd made a mistake, that he was just trying to feel normal again. But Elise didn't waver. "I needed you," she whispered, barely able to look at him. "When I was dying every night, I needed you." "I didn't know how to help," he said, voice trembling. "You didn't have to help," she said. "You just had to stay." They sat in silence after that. Two ghosts sharing the same house, both haunted by the boy they lost and the choices that followed. Despite the wreckage, there were moments, tiny, flickering moments, of warmth. Elise found herself talking to Noah again, not in despair, but in love. She'd sit by the tree she planted and tell him about her day, about how the sky looked like one of his finger paintings, about how she missed his jokes. She laughed again once, when she found an old video of him pretending to be a dinosaur, roaring through the living room. It was a painful laugh, but a real one. And in that moment, she realized she hadn't lost everything. She still had her memories, her motherhood, her strength. The fallout continued. James's family took Elise's side. His sister, who had always admired their marriage, called Elise and said, "You didn't deserve any of this. He lost the best part of his life when he lost you." It stung James more than anything else to realize that even his own blood no longer saw him as the man he once was. The legal proceedings moved forward quietly. Elise didn't make a spectacle. She didn't want revenge that scorched the earth. Just justice. Stability. Closure. Her lawyer was surgical, fair but firm. She secured the house, full spousal support, and sole ownership of all shared assets. James signed without a fight. There was nothing left in him to resist. As weeks passed, Elise began to write again. Not just letters to Noah, but real stories. Short pieces. Essays. Memories. She published one anonymously in a grief support forum. It was titled, "The Day I Lost My Son and Found My Voice." It was shared thousands of times. Women wrote to her. Strangers sent messages of thanks, saying her words had given them courage to leave toxic marriages, to speak their truth, to survive. And that's when Elise understood something else. Her pain wasn't just hers to carry. It had become a beacon, a story others could walk beside. James, meanwhile, faded. He moved into a small apartment across town. No one visited. No one called. He tried dating again, briefly, but no connection lasted. Everyone had heard the story. And worse, he had heard it too, over and over, echoing in his mind at night. The image of Elise holding Noah's shoes at the funeral. The way her hands trembled. The way he never reached for them. In the end, the greatest punishment wasn't what Elise did to him.
It was what he did to himself.
The knowledge that in the moment she needed him most, he abandoned her. And he could never undo that. Hope, for Elise, didn't return in a single moment. It came quietly, like dawn creeping in after a long night. A little more light each day. A little more peace. She didn't need to be whole again. She just needed to be strong enough to keep moving. And she was. For herself. For Noah. For the life still ahead. The days passed like slow-moving shadows, each one pulling Elise further from the woman who once waited by the window for James's car to turn into the driveway. She no longer watched the clock or counted the lies. Instead, she counted the steps it would take to reclaim her life. And then one morning, without ceremony, Elise woke up before sunrise, stood in front of the mirror, and whispered the words that would change everything. "I'm done surviving. It's time to rebuild." It wasn't an angry vow. It was quiet.
Steady.
But the certainty in her voice was new. The grief still lived in her bones, yes, but it no longer paralyzed her. It had transformed into something sharper, clarity. She saw now that her pain had become armor. The worst had already happened. Her son was gone. Her marriage had disintegrated. But she was still standing. That morning, she made herself breakfast for the first time in weeks. Not because she was hungry, but because she deserved to take care of herself again. She pulled on jeans and a sweater instead of the old robe she'd been wearing like a shield. She opened all the windows, letting in light and cold air, even though it stung. She turned on music, Noah's favorite playlist, and danced barefoot in the kitchen, tears running down her cheeks. It wasn't joy yet, but it was movement.
Life.
A start. Then she opened her laptop and began writing. Not just journals to Noah, but real words, clear, sharp, honest. She titled her new piece, *The Widow in the Marriage. In it, she wrote of a woman who buried her son and her husband in the same month, one in a grave, the other in truth. She didn't use names, but the emotions were raw, brutal, and real. It poured from her in one sitting. When she finished, she exhaled so deeply she startled herself. She submitted it to a national magazine. She expected silence. Instead, she received an email within 48 hours. We'd be honored to publish this. It was her turning point. Not because of the recognition, but because she had finally used her voice not just to mourn, but to inspire. Meanwhile, James's life was unraveling behind polished walls. His apartment was clean but sterile, a far cry from the warmth Elise once created. He ate takeout most nights, barely tasted it. He scrolled through old pictures, watching videos of Noah he hadn't dared open before. In one clip, Noah runs across a park, squealing as James chases him. "Faster, Daddy. Faster." The boy's laughter is pure, golden. James watches it on a loop, but every time the sound ends, the silence that follows is louder than before. For the first time, James couldn't escape. Alyssa was gone. The public shame still lingered. Even at work, he wasn't respected. He was tolerated. Clients trusted him less. His name had become a cautionary whisper in boardrooms. And at night, he lay awake wondering not how things went wrong, but when. When had he stopped loving Elise? Had he ever really stopped? He remembered her laugh. The way she used to kiss his forehead when he was tired. The smell of cinnamon in their kitchen during autumn. How her eyes lit up when Noah told a new joke, even if it made no sense. James had told himself he left because Elise had changed. But the truth was harder. He had changed.
He had chosen the easier path.
The escape. He had run from pain and found temporary comfort, not realizing he had left love behind. Guilt clawed at him now, not just for the affair, but for the silence, the abandonment, the way he never held Elise after the funeral, the way he pretended work was more important than grief. And the more he remembered, the smaller he felt. But Elise? Elise was rising. The magazine article went viral, shared across platforms. Women and men from all over the country sent messages, some full of grief, others full of thanks. You spoke the words I couldn't. I thought I was alone. You reminded me I'm allowed to survive. One message stood out. It came from a woman in Chicago. You are more than what was done to you. You're what you chose next. And Elise had already chosen. She took a portion of the divorce settlement and launched a project she'd been dreaming about quietly for years, a grief support program for parents who'd lost children. She partnered with a local community center, designed workshops, and called it the Lighthouse Project. It would provide space for healing, storytelling, shared silence, and remembrance. Elise didn't want to be a hero. She just didn't want others to walk through darkness without a hand to hold. The day she opened the doors to the first meeting, 10 parents showed up. By the second week, it was 40. Some cried. Some just listened. One father clutched Elise's hand and said, "You saved me from giving up." That night, Elise sat in her car and wept, not from grief this time, but from the overwhelming grace of knowing her pain had a purpose. James found out about the project through a former colleague. He stared at the website for hours. Read every page. Watched a video of Elise speaking to a group of parents, her voice clear but gentle. He didn't recognize the woman on screen. Not at first. She was radiant in her strength, unshaken. The kind of woman who could change lives with a sentence. That night, he called her. She let the phone ring twice before answering. "Elise," he said, voice thick.
She didn't speak.
"I saw what you've built. It's beautiful." A long pause. "Thank you," she said finally. "I'm sorry," he whispered. "I know I've said it before, but I need you to know. I think I was afraid of your pain. Of mine too. But you, Elise, you've become someone I don't deserve to even speak to." She didn't cry. She didn't get angry. Instead, she said something that would stay with him forever. "You always had a choice. I just stopped waiting for you to make the right one." Silence. "I hope you heal, James. Truly. But not with me." She hung up. And in that moment, something in James finally broke open. Not the arrogant part. Not the defensive. But the part that had been buried under denial and fear. He sat on the edge of his bed, the phone still in his hand, and wept like he hadn't even at his son's funeral. Elise never heard from him again. A month later, she held a small ceremony beneath Noah's tree. It was just her and a few close friends. They lit lanterns and sent them into the sky. Each carried a message written in ink and hope. "Thank you for choosing me to be your mom," Elise wrote on hers. As the lantern lifted, she smiled. Not because the pain was gone, but because she had turned it into something that mattered. Elise had found peace, not in forgetting, but in choosing who she would be after. And she chose to be light. Spring arrived gently in Richmond. The air grew softer, and the cold grief that had wrapped around Elise's bones began to loosen its grip. The tree planted in Noah's memory bloomed early, its blossoms pale pink, delicate, as if the earth itself was trying to make amends. Elise took it as a sign. It was time to let go of what still bound her to the past, not in forgetfulness, but in forgiveness. She didn't plan to see James again. Not ever. But life, in its strange rhythm, brought them together one last time. It was a Sunday morning when Elise got the message from the community center's director. "Elise, there's a man here asking about the lighthouse project. Says he just wants to observe. I think you should come." There was no name, but her gut told her exactly who it was. She thought about ignoring it, thought about protecting her peace. But something pulled her there. Not curiosity, not anger, but the chance to see the final piece of her story laid bare. When she entered the room, she saw him sitting in the back row.
James.
He looked thinner, older, like someone who had been worn down by the weight of his own choices. He sat with his hands folded, not moving, not speaking, eyes fixed on the floor. Elise paused, then walked past him without acknowledgement. She stood at the front and welcomed the small group of attendees for that day's circle. 4 new faces, 2 returning parents, and 1 ghost from her past. The session began. One mother cried through her story of losing twin daughters in a house fire. A father broke down remembering his son's final moments in the hospital. Elise listened, offered comfort, but her mind kept drifting to James, still silent, still watching. When the session ended and the room emptied, only James remained. Elise turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "Elise," he said, barely above a whisper.
"Please."
"Just 5 minutes." She hesitated, then nodded. They stepped outside into the garden behind the center. The tree branches overhead swayed gently in the breeze. She crossed her arms, waiting. "I've been going to grief counseling," he began. "I talk about Noah, about you, about everything I ran from. I wanted you to know that. Not for sympathy, just because you deserve to hear it." Elise looked at him, searching for the man she had once loved. He was there, beneath the guilt and ruin, but smaller now. Quieter. Not dangerous. Just broken. "I watched your video," he continued. "You said something that hit me hard. You said, grief is not a wound to heal. It's a place to grow. I've never grown from anything in my life. I've always avoided pain or covered it. With work. With other people. With lies. But I can't anymore. I see that now." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded photo, one of Noah, sitting on Elise's lap, drawing something with crayons. James placed it gently on the bench between them. I carry this everywhere now, he said. I know it doesn't undo anything.
I just thought you should know he's still with me.
Every single day. The wind moved softly between them. Elise picked up the photo, studied it. Her breath hitched, but she didn't cry. You waited too long, she said, voice calm. But I'm glad you came. For him. James nodded. I understand why you won't forgive me. But I forgive you. For the silence. For the distance. For not being able to let me in after we lost him. I get it now. You were carrying all of us. Elise's throat tightened. Not because of his apology, but because it was the first time he had taken real responsibility. There was no defense. No excuses. Just truth. I forgave you months ago, she said. Not for you. For me. I couldn't carry your guilt and my grief. One had to go. A long silence stretched between them. Then James smiled sadly. You've built something beautiful here. Something I'll never be a part of. But I'm proud of you. That surprised her. Not because of the words, but because he meant them. She nodded once, then turned to leave. Elise, he called out. Will you ever stop loving him? She turned her head slightly. Not in this life, she said. And then she walked away. That moment wasn't a reconciliation in the traditional sense. There was no reunion. No healing of their relationship. But it was closure, the kind that allows you to breathe deeper, to stand taller. Elise didn't feel victorious. She felt light, as if the final tether to the life she had grieved was gently untying itself. In the weeks that followed, Elise expanded the Lighthouse Project. She created online sessions, partnered with therapists, started writing a book, not just about loss, but about survival. The kind that doesn't roar, but endures. She built a small bench under Noah's tree, painted it ocean blue, and carved into it. Asterisk, you were here. You were loved. Always. Asterisk. One evening, just as the sun dipped low, she sat there alone, fingers brushing over the words. Fireflies began to flicker in the garden. She closed her eyes, tilted her face toward the breeze, and whispered, "Thank you for choosing me." Her phone buzzed. It was a message from the magazine editor. Asterisk, we've nominated your piece for an award. Asterisk. She smiled. Not because of the recognition, but because at last something beautiful had grown from the ashes. In the end, Elise didn't just survive betrayal. She transformed it. She didn't just mourn her son, she honored him. And though James had been a chapter of her story, he no longer defined the ending. That belonged to her. Alone, yet full. Wounded, yet whole. Grieving, but never broken. And as the lanterns rose into the night sky again that year, each one a message, a memory, a promise, Elise stood among them, hand on her heart, and knew. She was free.